They gave her until the first snow to be gone. A widow, 22 years old, with a deed that was suddenly worth less than the paper it was printed on. They said the land would kill a lone woman before Christmas, that the Wyoming winter did not bargain. But what they didn't know was that her father had taught her to read the one book that mattered in that country, the earth itself. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The wagon road that cut south from Cheyenne was, by October of 1886, little more than two parallel suggestions in the immense, dun-colored landscape of the high plains. From that road, a traveler looking west would have seen only the vast, rising sweep of land meeting a pale and indifferent sky. They might have noted a smudge of smoke, thin and tentative, rising from a half-built cabin set near a shallow, seasonal creek bed. The structure itself was raw ponderosa pine, the logs not yet sealed with daubing, the roof shingles laid but not yet tarred. It looked vulnerable, a temporary claim on a place that tolerated nothing temporary. This was the homestead of Elias and Lenora Hatch, or what was left of it. A stranger would have seen the figure of a woman working near the cabin, her movements measured and economical as she restrung a line of barbed wire on a set of unsteady posts. Lenora Hatch did not work with the frantic energy of fear, but with the steady, focused rhythm of someone who has calculated the work to be done and the daylight remaining to do it. On the afternoon of October the 12th, two riders approached from the east, their forms slowly resolving out of the shimmering distance. She saw them long before she could hear the creak of their saddle leather. She did not stop her work, twisting the wire tight with her pliers, her hands already calloused and scored. One man was Marcus Hatch, her late husband's older brother, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of grim pragmatism. The other was Mr. Davies, the land agent from the county seat, a man who smelled of ledger books and stale tobacco, whose authority rested in the sheaf of papers he carried in a worn satchel. They dismounted without greeting and followed her inside the single-room cabin. The air was cool, smelling of sawdust and the faint, lingering scent of the poultice she had used on Elias's leg in the final hours after the rattlesnake had struck him. They sat at the rough-planked table Elias had built. Davies spread the papers out, his fingers tapping the official seal. The language he used was careful, devoid of overt cruelty, yet its effect was absolute. The homestead patent, filed under the Act of 1862, had been in her husband's name. His death, coming before they could prove up the claim, with the required 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation, created a legal ambiguity. Since they had no children, the claim did not automatically pass to her. It was, he explained, a matter for probate, and Marcus, as Elias's next of kin, had filed a petition. "It's for your own good, Lenora," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "You can't manage this place alone. The winter will take you before the government does." Davies cleared his throat. The county cannot be seen to condone a situation that will almost certainly end in a preventable tragedy. The recommendation is that you relinquish the claim in favor of Marcus, who is prepared to offer you a fair price for the livestock and the improvements. They gave her a deadline, a date that hung in the air like an axe, the first significant snowfall. After that, they would return with the sheriff. She listened, her hands resting flat on the table, her gaze steady. When they were finished, she gave her answer. "This is my home. I am not leaving." Her refusal was not loud or emotional. It was a simple statement of fact, a correction to their false description of her life. They left as they came, their faces hard with certainty, the wheels of their wagon cutting two deep, accusing lines in the dust of the yard. The silence that followed their departure was profound. The community, what little of it existed in that sparse valley, was a loose constellation of 4 other homesteads, miles apart, connected by rumor and the weekly supply wagon. Word of Lenora's refusal traveled swiftly, carried by Marcus. The consensus formed with the quiet, inexorable logic of the frontier. The widow hatch was either touched by grief or possessed by a foolish pride that would not outlast the first blizzard. The response was not hostility, but a careful, collective withdrawal. Mrs. Gable, whose land bordered hers to the south, no longer waved from her porch when Lenora was in the fields. The supply wagon from Cheyenne, which had once stopped for her raised flag, now rumbled past on the main road, the driver looking straight ahead. Marcus had informed the proprietor in town that his sister-in-law was packing to leave and would require no further credit or provisions. It was an abandonment enacted through bureaucratic denial, a way of making her disappear before she was physically gone. They were erasing her from the ledger of the living. The land itself seemed to confirm their judgment. The signs of a severe winter were everywhere, for those who knew how to read them. The woolly bear caterpillars wore thick black coats. The geese had flown south 3 weeks ahead of the almanac's prediction. A lone trapper who passed through spoke of beaver lodges chinked with an unusual amount of mud and the remarkable density of their pelts. The sunsets burned a deep, prophetic crimson that bled across the horizon and lingered long after the sun was gone, a sight the old-timers called a snow sky. In the settlement 20 miles east, men laid in extra cords of wood and double-checked the seals on their root cellars. The coming cold was the main topic of conversation at the general store, and Lenora's name was often invoked as a cautionary tale, the foolish woman who thought she could stand against what was coming. They expected her to be gone by the first hard frost, driven out by loneliness and the dawning realization of her own folly. But Lenora Hatch was engaged in a different set of calculations. She watched the same signs, read the same sky, but her interpretation was not of an ending, but of a deadline. Her work did not cease. It merely changed its focus. She no longer mended the fences meant to contain cattle she might not have through the winter. Instead, she began to walk the full 320-acre boundary of her claim, her gaze fixed not on the arable land Elias had prized, but on the rugged, seemingly useless western edge of the property. This section was dominated by a series of sandstone outcroppings and a narrow fissure in the earth, a slot canyon so tight and unassuming that most would have dismissed it as a geological flaw. Elias had called it the Stone Crack, a place good for nothing but sheltering snakes. But Lenora carried a different inheritance. In the chill of the early mornings, she had noticed that the frost never seemed to settle as heavily near the mouth of that canyon. Sometimes, if the air was perfectly still, she could see a faint, almost invisible wisp of vapor rising from the rocks within. It was a sign, a memory of a voice from long ago, a seed of knowledge that was beginning to germinate in the cold soil of her desperation. She was not looking for an escape, she was looking for an entrance. The knowledge had been a gift from her father, Thomas Keene, a man who had spent his life reading the Earth's secrets. He was a mining surveyor, a self-taught geologist who understood the world not as a surface to be farmed, but as a complex structure of pressures, faults, and hidden energies. He had carried his knowledge not in books, but in his hands and eyes. The memory that surfaced now for Lenora was from a time she was 14, following him through the high country of the Colorado Rockies. It had not been a lesson, but a conversation, a stream of observations shared as they walked. He had stopped by a fissure in a granite rock face, a place where a patch of deep green moss flourished even in the late autumn chill. He knelt and had her press her hand against the stone near the crack. It was faintly, unmistakably warm. "The earth has a fever in places, Len," he had said, his voice quiet with a kind of reverence. "A slow, deep fever. Water gets down close to it, boils, and finds its way back up through the cracks. Most people see a spring and think of water. They don't think about the heat that drives it." He had explained the principles to her as if she were a colleague, not a child. He spoke of thermal gradients, of how certain types of rock, like the sandstone common to this territory, were poor conductors of heat. A narrow canyon carved through such rock, he'd explained, could trap that geothermal warmth like a stone bottle. "It's not the fire that keeps a man alive," he told her, tracing the line of the fissure with his finger. "It's the heat held in the rock. The fire is temporary. The rock remembers warmth for 1,000 years." He taught her the signs to look for, the specific mineral deposits left by hot water, the way certain hardy plants clustered near a thermal vent, the faint smell of sulfur on the air, the way snow would melt first in a line on the ground, revealing a hidden fault beneath. He called it finding the Earth's hearth. For Lenora, at 14, it had been a fascinating abstraction, another piece of the complex, wonderful puzzle that was her father's mind. She had stored the information away without any thought of its use, a collection of curious facts about geology. She had believed him, of course, with the simple faith of a daughter, but belief and knowledge were not the same thing. Belief was trusting a map. Knowledge was setting foot on the land it described. Now, with the Wyoming winter gathering its forces on the horizon, she would have to see if her father's map was true. She would have to turn his words into a place she could live. Her methodical preparation began on October 15th. She hitched her sole remaining ox, a placid, powerful beast named Benjamin, to the farm wagon, and began a process that would have looked to any observer like the final, desperate dismantling of a failed dream. She was not packing to leave. She was repurposing her home. She started with the interior of the half-finished cabin. Using a crowbar and hammer, she carefully pried up the floorboards Elias had laid for the bedroom they would never share. Each plank was precious, measured and stacked. She took down the interior partition wall he had framed, salvaging every stud and nail. These were the materials for a different kind of structure, one dictated not by convention, but by the unique geology of her land. She worked in the liminal hours of dawn and dusk, her movements shrouded by the low light, treating her isolation not as a curse, but as a strategic asset. Invisibility was her shield. The focus of her labor was the narrow slot canyon at the western edge of her property. It was a tight fissure, no more than 12 feet across at its widest point, with sheer sandstone walls that rose nearly 40 feet high. Deep inside, around a sharp bend that shielded it from the prevailing winds, was the source of the faint vapor she had observed. A small, steaming pool of water bubbling gently from a crack in the rock floor. The air in this part of the canyon was palpably warmer, thick with the damp, mineral scent of the Earth's interior. This was the place her father had described. This would be her shelter. Over the next 2 weeks, she and Benjamin hauled the salvaged timbers from the cabin to the canyon mouth. The work was brutal, a constant strain on muscles unaccustomed to such loads. Her hands, already calloused, blistered and bled and calloused anew. She learned to pace herself by the slow, steady rhythm of the ox, to conserve her energy, to time her heaviest work by the arc of the pale autumn sun. Using the sheer canyon walls as her foundation, she constructed a roof over a 20-foot-long section, laying the timbers across the opening and covering them with the planks from the cabin floor. She waterproofed this crude roof with a thick layer of sod and packed earth, creating a living ceiling that would both insulate and bear the coming weight of the snow. She built a solid front wall from the remaining logs, leaving a single low doorway and a small opening for a window she would later cover with a greased hide. The gaps between the logs and the uneven rock she chinked with a thick, sticky mortar she made from river clay, sand, and dried grass. Deeper inside the canyon, beyond her living quarters, she fashioned a small, 3-sided pen for Benjamin and the 2 chickens she possessed. Finally, she moved her supplies. The 100-pound sacks of flour and beans, the barrels of salted pork and cornmeal, Elias's tools, her quilts and blankets, and a small, precious crate containing her father's geology texts and his brass thermometer. She had created a burrow, a den, a pocket of engineered safety tucked into the Earth's warm seam. The first true test came not with the fury of a blizzard, but with the quiet, insidious arrival of the deep cold. On the night of November 3rd, the sky cleared to a brilliant, star-filled dome, and the temperature on the open plains plummeted. The wind, which had blown steadily for days, fell silent, and a killing frost descended, coating every surface in a thick, crystalline layer of white. Lenora, standing outside the wooden wall of her new shelter, watched her breath turn to a dense cloud of vapor that hung in the still air. She consulted the thermometer she had hung on an outside nail. It read 9 degrees Fahrenheit. A thin sheet of ice was already forming on the water bucket. The cold was a physical presence, a pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life out of the air. She retreated inside her canyon dwelling, pulling a heavy blanket over the doorway. The world within was entirely different. The air was warm and humid, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the hot spring that bubbled softly in the darkness further down the canyon. The immense mass of the sandstone walls, warmed by the constant flow of geothermal heat from deep within the earth, radiated a steady, gentle warmth. There was no fire, no stove consuming precious fuel, only the ancient, stored energy of the planet itself. She walked 20 feet from the spring, near her cot and small table, and hung the thermometer on a salvaged nail driven into a timber. She waited 10 minutes, watching the thin red line of the alcohol. It settled and held firm at 52 degrees, a 43-degree difference. It was more than survivable. It was comfortable. The patient ox, Benjamin, stood quietly in his pen, his own body heat contributing a small but measurable amount to the ambient warmth of the enclosed space. That night, Lenora did not huddle for warmth or shiver under her blankets. She heated water from the spring for tea, the steam rising in the gentle lantern light. She sat at her table, wrapped in one of Elias's old quilts, and listened to the profound silence of the frozen world outside. The silence was not empty. It was the sound of the cold making its point on the plains above. Here, in her stone refuge, it was merely a distant report from another country. She picked up one of her father's books, the worn leather cool beneath her fingers. His quiet, certain voice seemed to echo in the warm stone around her. Belief had become knowledge, proven by the simple, irrefutable evidence of the thermometer. Survival was no longer in doubt. Only its difficulty and the long, solitary months of winter remained. In the second week of November, after the first light snow had dusted the plains, a visitor arrived. It was Mrs. Gable, her face etched with a mixture of pity and neighborly concern. She had ridden over, she said, to see if Lenora needed help packing her wagon for the journey back east. She found the main cabin looking ransacked and abandoned, its interior boards stripped away, a cold wind blowing through the unchinked logs. Alarmed, she saw the faint tracks of the wagon and the ox leading west, toward the useless rock formations. Fearing the worst, she followed them. She found the mouth of the slot canyon blocked by a solid, if crudely built, wooden wall. A thin wisp of steam curled from a makeshift flue pipe sticking out of the earthen roof. Lenora emerged from the low doorway, her expression calm and unreadable. Mrs. Gable, standing in the biting cold, could feel a wave of warm, damp air wash over her from the opening. She peered past Lenora and saw the ox, the neatly stacked sacks of flour, the order and intention of the place. It did not look like a desperate hideout. It looked planned. She stammered her offer of help, which now sounded absurd. "I'm managing fine, thank you, Clara," Lenora said, her voice even. Mrs. Gable left in a state of profound confusion, unable to reconcile what she had seen with the community's narrative of the foolish, grieving widow. Her report only deepened the mystery. A week later, a more official wagon arrived, carrying Marcus Hatch and the land agent, Mr. Davies. They had come, under the pretense of a final welfare check, to confirm their own predictions. They expected to find Lenora gone, or worse, huddled in the freezing cabin, broken and ready to accept their terms. They found the empty cabin and followed the same tracks to the canyon. Their reaction was not confusion, but a cold, simmering anger. This was not desperation. This was defiance. The structure blocking the canyon was an affront, a testament to a will they had severely underestimated. "Lenora!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing flatly against the rock. "Come out of there! This is madness! You'll die in that hole before the new year!" She appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim warmth within. She said nothing. "Mr." Davies stepped forward, his tone clipped and official. "Mrs. Hatch, the county will not be held responsible for your corpse. We are making a final offer of assistance to vacate this claim." She simply looked at them, her silence a more powerful response than any argument. "I'm home," she said. "I'm not in need of assistance." Frustrated and impotent, they turned to leave. Their authority, backed by law and social convention, meant nothing here. As they climbed back into their buckboard, Marcus's voice carried on the sharp wind, low and venomous, directed at Davies but meant for her to hear. "Let the winter have her," he said. "It'll solve the problem for good." The great blizzard arrived on the 17th of December. It did not come with the drama of a sudden storm, but with a slow, methodical erasure of the world. The sky turned a uniform, pearlescent gray, and the snow began to fall. Not in flakes, but in a dense, vertical curtain of white that muffled all sound and collapsed all distance. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind howled out of the north, a relentless physical force that scoured the plains, piling snow into immense, sculpted drifts and driving the temperature down to 30 degrees below zero. With the wind chill, it was a cold that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The Wyoming winter was making its argument, and the homesteads of the valley were forced to listen. Across the territory, the storm exacted its price. We see it in parallel vignettes of struggle and failure. The Gable family, whose land bordered Lenora's, heard the main beam of their cabin roof crack under the immense weight of the snow on the second night. They retreated to their root cellar, a cold, damp space where they huddled together, burning chairs, and then the kitchen table to keep a small, smoky fire alive. A lone trapper, Pierre Dubois, an experienced man of the woods, was caught checking his line 2 miles from his shack. They found him in the spring, frozen solid, his hand outstretched as if reaching for a destination he never saw. The Schmidt family, German immigrants new to the territory and its unforgiving nature, had built their barn with more hope than engineering. The wind found a weak seam, tore the roof off, and the structure collapsed, killing their entire herd of 20 cattle. The culmination of their life's savings and their only hope for the future. Meanwhile, inside the stone sanctuary of the Slot Canyon, Lenora Hatch experienced the blizzard as a distant rumor. The wind howled high above the canyon rim, a sound like a great ocean breaking on a faraway shore, but not a whisper of it penetrated her shelter. The snow piled deep on her earthen roof, but the sturdy timbers, anchored to the unyielding rock walls, held fast. The snow itself became an asset, a thick white blanket of insulation that further sealed her home against the external cold. The temperature inside her living space, moderated by the constant gentle heat of the spring and the thermal mass of the rock, never fell below 45 degrees. She moved with a calm, unhurried rhythm, her days governed by simple, necessary tasks. She tended to Benjamin and the chickens, ground her daily portion of flour for flatbread, mended a tear in her winter coat, and by the steady, clean light of her lantern, she read her father's books on structural geology. The contrast was the entire argument. It was not her resources that saved her, but her knowledge. While the established community, with its conventional wisdom and sturdier-looking homes, fought and suffered, she rested in comfort. having met the winter not with force, but with understanding. The blizzard broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world transformed and paralyzed. The sky was a sharp, painful blue, and the sun shone on a landscape buried under 8 feet of silent, crystalline snow. Travel was impossible, and every homestead was an isolated island. It was a week later when Lenora, clearing snow from her doorway, saw a figure struggling toward the canyon from the south. It was Mr. Gable, his face blackened with frostbite, his movements slow and desperate. His family was in dire straits. Their cabin was ruined, their food supply soaked and frozen, and his wife, Clara, had fallen ill with a lung-rattling fever. He had seen the faint wisp of steam rising from Lenora's flue pipe, a tiny sign of life in the vast white wasteland, and had spent the entire day fighting his way through the drifts as a last resort. Lenora acted without hesitation or reproach. She brought him inside, sat him by the warmest part of the shelter, and gave him hot broth until the shivering subsided. Then she packed a small sled with blankets, medicine, and food, and went back with him. The journey was arduous, but they returned before dusk with a weak Mrs. Gable and their 2 small, frightened children. The shelter was now crowded, the space tight, but it was warm and safe. Critically, Lenora refused to be a mere charity station. As Clara rested and the children slept, she took Mr. Gable deeper into the canyon and explained the principles of her survival. She had him feel the warmth of the rock, showed him how the narrowness of the canyon prevented the heat from escaping, pointed out the ventilation system she had rigged to keep the air fresh. "It is the Earth's heat," she explained, her voice simple and direct. "It's always there. You only have to know where to look for the door." She was not offering a handout. She was transmitting the knowledge. Word of the canyon shelter, carried by a deeply humbled and grateful Mr. Gable who made a second trip to check on another neighbor, began to spread. Days later, the Schmidt family arrived, having lost everything but their own lives. She took them in, too. Her solitary refuge became a small, cramped but functioning community, its existence a quiet refutation of everyone who had written her off. She taught them what her father had taught her, because knowledge that saves only its holder is knowledge poorly used. In the first week of January, with the deep cold still locked in place over the territory, another wagon appeared, its progress through the massive drifts tortuously slow. 2 figures were leading the exhausted horses by their bridles. It was Marcus Hatch and Mr. Davies. Their own arrogance had become their undoing. Confident in their preparations, they had set out from the county seat with supplies, but their wagon had overturned in a hidden drift. One of their horses had broken its leg and had to be shot. They were caught out, miles from any shelter, in a cold they had underestimated. When they finally stumbled toward Lenora's canyon, it was not as arbiters of the law, but as desperate supplicants. Marcus was suffering from severe frostbite on his hands and feet, his face a mask of pain. Davies, older and less resilient, was shivering uncontrollably, his skin pale, his words slurred with the onset of hypothermia. They saw the scene before they even reached the entrance. The Gables, the Schmidts, the children, all moving about in the relative warmth of the canyon mouth, safe and provided for. The humiliation was absolute and silent. They had come to a place they had condemned, to be saved by the woman they had left to die. Lenora met them at the entrance. She looked at their condition, her face betraying no triumph, no anger, only a clinician's assessment of the damage. She simply said, "Get inside." She treated them with the same impartial care she had shown everyone else. She attended to Marcus's frostbite, first rubbing the affected areas with snow to slowly restore circulation, then immersing them in lukewarm water from the spring, the correct, if painful, treatment. She wrapped a shivering Mr. Davies in warm blankets and forced hot, sweet tea between his lips. She gave them the same food, the same portion of stew, and the same space on the floor as the other families. This equality of treatment was the only verdict she needed to deliver. She made no speeches, offered no recriminations. The simple, humane act of saving their lives, of treating them no better and no worse than her friends, was a more profound and damning judgment than any words of accusation could ever be. Their cruelty was answered not with vengeance, but with competence and grace. When the great cold finally broke in late February and the trails became passable again, a small delegation traveled to the county seat. It consisted of Mr. Gable and Mr. Schmidt. They went directly to the land office and gave sworn, notarized testimony to a new agent, Davies having resigned his post. They spoke not only of their rescue, but of the genius of Lenora's shelter. They described its construction, the steady warmth, the well-managed provisions, the clear evidence of foresight, engineering, and profound competence. They testified that nearly a dozen people owed their lives to her knowledge and preparation. Faced with the unimpeachable accounts of multiple witnesses and confronted with the silent, shamed non-opposition of Marcus Hatch, who had already signed papers relinquishing any claim, the bureaucracy had no choice but to bow to the facts on the ground. The original homestead patent was reviewed and reissued. On March 12, 1887, the deed for all 320 acres was officially recorded in the Laramie County Courthouse, solely in the name of Lenora Keene Hatch. The land was hers, not by the letter of a law that had failed her, but by the unassailable truth of her survival. Time accelerated, its passage measured now in seasons rather than days. Lenora Hatch never left the canyon. That first crude shelter became the foundation for something permanent. With the help of the Gables and later the Schmidts, she expanded her dwelling into a proper way station. They blasted and cleared rock to widen the entrance, built a small, sturdy stable against the warm north wall of the canyon, and constructed several sleeping rooms, each heated by the same reliable geothermal warmth. Hatch's Rest, as it came to be known, became a fixture on the Cheyenne Trail, the only guaranteed safe harbor against the sudden lethal blizzards of the Wyoming high country. For 40 years, her reputation was built on a simple, unbroken promise. No traveler who reached her door ever froze. She taught the principles of what she had built to anyone who showed genuine interest, her knowledge of thermal geology spreading through the territory in quiet conversations, passed from one homesteader to another. In 1895, a young reporter from the Wyoming Tribune, hearing tales of the Canyon Widow, made the journey to see for himself. His feature article made her a quiet legend, but she politely declined the offers to lecture or have her methods formally published that followed. "The knowledge belongs to the earth," she would tell visitors. "I only paid attention." The lives of those she touched branched out across the years. The Gables remained her closest friends and partners in running the way station. Their children grew up thinking of her as a second mother. The Schmidts, with a loan from Lenora, bought a new plot of land in a more sheltered valley and rebuilt their lives, their descendants becoming successful ranchers in the state. Marcus Hatch, unable to face the community or the woman who had saved him, sold his holdings and moved to California, fading into the anonymity of the West. Mr. Davies died of pneumonia 2 years later, a footnote in the county records. Lenora lived to be 78, a woman known for her quiet authority and her deep, unsentimental kindness. She died peacefully in her sleep on a warm night in the spring of 1942, in a comfortable room carved from the same sandstone that had sheltered her so long ago. Decades later, in the autumn of 1978, a university geology student, mapping fault lines in the region, stumbled upon the overgrown entrance to the long-abandoned way station. Intrigued by the unusual rock-cut structures, he made his way inside to what was left of her original living quarters. The roof had collapsed long ago, but the rock walls were intact. He noted with academic curiosity that while a biting November wind was scouring the plains outside, the air within the stone chamber, near the still steaming hot spring, was a full 20 degrees warmer. The system, he wrote in his field journal, still functioned. It was a final, wordless confirmation, a quiet testament to a life built not on what she owned, but on what she knew.